Hey everybody, it's Jamie, triathlon nutrition coach. Hope you're doing well. So today we're going to discuss a topic that I raised on Instagram, and it is the fear of bonking actually holding you back from making progress with your body composition and performance goals? So firstly, I just want to talk about what bonking is. So in the context of endurance sport, I think the first time I heard it was when I read Lance Armstrong's book, It's Not About the Bike, like 20 odd years ago. And he would talk about going out long rides, running out of energy. And that's what bonking is. It's when we kind of underfuel a session, go out, run out of energy. And if you've ever done that, you will know that it's like a pretty unpleasant experience. So why could it be that that is affecting your ability to make progress with your nutrition, body composition, etc., etc.? Well, the fear of running out of energy, it's like a genuine one. It's a real one. It might be based on past experiences. It might also just be based on this like innate human worry that we're going to start breaking down. So the reason that it's a problem is that we often essentially overreact and we go too far the other way. So we're so worried about running out of energy that actually what we do instead is we consume more than we actually need. And of course, when we consume more food than we need, it's generally speaking not going to be more chicken, rice and broccoli. It's going to be either products which are marketed as endurance fuel, so gels, drinks, that kind of stuff, or worse still, some sort of junk food. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about why we've got this fear and why it's driving us to make these bad choices. So I think within endurance sport, a bit like gym culture, there's always been quite a strong narrative around peddling or selling kind of supplements. So they're marketed really well. Shiny packets, big promises, often endorsed by, a pro athlete or a celebrity or somebody who automatically you trust. And of course, it's in the interests of people selling this sort of stuff to tell you that you need a lot of it, which kind of makes sense. So we'll hear things like, oh, you need to fuel every 20 minutes when you're out on a long ride, never get behind on fueling, things like that. So it becomes like a little bit ingrained in our mind that we need to consume all of this fuel to support the training that we're doing. So the other thing that I think really kind of messes with our heads a little bit, and this is relatively recent in the history of endurance sport, is now we're all wearing Garmins and whatnot. We go out for a ride or a long run and it'll say you've just burned 2,000, 3,000 calories, whatever it might be. So I'll hear from a lot of people very often, oh, look, I've burned 3,000 calories. I need to get this fuel in. Now, the first thing to understand is that the devices that we're wearing, I think most people probably know this, are not accurate. So when it says you burn X amount of calories, that doesn't mean you burn X amount of calories. But I think the other thing, which is really important here, is that the fuel you're taking on board, the job of that isn't to replace all of the calories that you have burnt. And that is especially true when you're out doing kind of lower intensity zone 2 sort of stuff. So whilst we want to replace those calories, like potentially after, and we want to fuel before, and we want to take on something during, the problem with taking stuff when you are actually training is it's generally going to be more highly processed, calorie dense, nutrient poor foods. So where possible, what we want to do is fuel the session before really well, recover really well after, and then have what we need during the session, not more than we need. Okay, so let's look at some common scenarios where this kind of worry about running out of energy and then our overcompensation might be most common. So the most common, and it'll come as no surprise, is probably the long weekend ride, which can be anything from an hour to 6 hours, depending on where you are in the season and the events that you're training for. So when we go out on these rides, a lot of people won't fuel like particularly well before they actually go out. So that's the first mistake, especially if you've got family and a busy day, the chances are you're going to get up, not have a chance for a big breakfast, get out, and therefore take a pocket full of gels, bars, drinks to kind of fuel during the session. Now, the other thing that often happens in these long rides, especially if you're going out as a group, is you're going to have some sort of cafe stop where you can have a coffee and a cake. And all of this is kind of justified by the training that we're actually doing. We're going out, we're doing this huge training volume by normal people's standards. And when I say normal, I mean non-triathletes, non-endurance athletes. And as such, we take all these gels, we have a coffee and a cake, and essentially what we're doing is we're consuming way more energy than we actually need to support the session that we're doing. And we're justifying that because we're doing this big amount of training volume, and deep down, somewhere within our like prehistoric instinct, we're thinking, what if we run out of energy? This is going to be awful. Always better to fuel a bit more than not fuel enough. But we don't just tend to fuel a bit more, we tend to fuel way more. And of course, the result of that is poor body composition, poor fueling, and potentially poor health. When you're consuming this level of highly processed sugars, essentially it's not good for you, even if you're burning some of that off through the exercise you're doing. And what we're talking about here is not being aware of body composition from an aesthetic perspective, although of course most of us do want to look, half decent as well as be able to perform well. We're talking about it really from a performance perspective. I nearly couldn't say performance there. So we're thinking about, why does body composition matter? It matters because it affects our power to weight ratio. It's going to affect our running economy, how well we're able to get up the hills when we're racing. If you're going to be racing in hotter conditions, carrying more body fat is going to add greater stress. It's going to slow you down. It's going to make the experience more unpleasant. So whilst, a lot of triathletes and endurance athletes will obsess over things like their watts, their pace, their VO2 max, I think an awful lot of us are more inclined to ignore the negative effects of body composition and fueling on our performance. So some sessions, some workouts will require more of a fueling focus, but not every session does. So let's think about what sessions will require a greater fueling focus. They're going to be brick sessions or any form of kind of like race simulation. Because of course, not only is that important from a kind of performance perspective in terms of the session, but you are actually also practicing in race strategies. Very long sessions, of course, there is a greater importance to the fueling that you're doing. Although I would always argue that you need to really focus initially on the fueling beforehand, not just during. Any particularly long interval-based workouts, again, going to add greater stress. So essentially, any session which is particularly stressful, you perceive as ridiculously hard, they're ones which will require a greater emphasis on fueling. But of course, most of the sessions that we're doing in training are not like that. So when we think about, more aerobic sessions, zone 2, shorter zone 2, easier rides, easier runs, like technique-based swims, then they require less of an emphasis on fueling, and certainly fueling in session. So one of the reasons behind that as well is what we're trying to do is teach the body to be efficient with the fuel it has. So if we're constantly overfueling every session that we're doing, then essentially we're training our body to want more fuel, require more fuel, and not just our body like physiologically, but psychologically we become attached to the idea that we need to constantly fuel more. Now, it can be quite difficult to know if you are overfueling or you are underfueling, and this is especially true if you're not tracking your metrics. So triathletes are great at tracking pace, power, heart rate, and we can obsess over those numbers, but most do not track their nutrition with the same level of diligence or accuracy. So what do I mean about tracking your nutrition? Really, what we're talking about is tracking the food that we eat. So that's the food that we eat day to day, breakfast, lunch, dinner and snacks, but also we'd want to include in that any calories, any fuel that we take in during training. So tracking will increase our awareness. It'll help answer questions that you might have, like, are you eating more than you realise? Also, are you eating less than you realise or consuming less than you realise? So the way I see tracking calories and tracking the food that you eat, and in that we would include gels and drinks, is it's a little bit like, in the olden days, and I'm old in comparison to a lot of people, well, not old, but 48. When I started training, I'd go out for a run. I had no heart rate monitor, certainly no Garmin. I didn't even wear a watch. I'd just go for a run. I didn't know how long it took me. I didn't know how far I had gone. Of course, now we're able to analyse all of that in much more detail. And what that means is it allows us to get more out of each session and track each session. So if I'm going out for an hour run, I'll know what pace to run at. I'll be able to track that against my heart rate and over time see whether I'm improving. And if not, then it's a signal that something needs to change. Either more volume, more intensity, more rest. And the same is true with calories. If we're not tracking stuff, we can never know whether we need to change anything. So the key message here is that bonking, running out of energy, it's a real thing. Like, it can happen. It's happened to me. But so is overfueling. And it's way more common to overfuel than it is to underfuel, certainly during a session. So the goal is not excessive fueling, but it's not overly restrictive fueling either. It's trying to find that middle ground where you are able to fuel the session you're doing beforehand, during, and then recover appropriately afterward. When you get that right, body composition will improve, and with that, so will performance, and so will health. No one wants to do these big endurance events and feel like they are carrying too much body fat. You might not want to be, a fitness model or super lean, but we want to feel strong, fit, healthy, and all of those things will help us perform better. So good endurance nutrition isn't about constantly eating more. It's about fueling the sessions that you're doing whilst managing your body composition so that you can improve your performance. It's as simple as that. Now, if you're a triathlete or an endurance athlete who's looking to improve your body composition because you want to get faster, and that can be at any level. I've worked with people who go to Kona, I've worked with Olympic athletes, I've worked with people who've never raced in their life. But if you're looking to improve body composition, performance and health, then that's what I do. They're the people I work with. Feel free to check down below or wherever the links are and get in touch anytime.